Hey everyone, a very happy new year to you all. My name's Al Horner, and this is Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. We're kicking off 2023 in style today with the one and only Noah Baumbach dropping in for a chat. His latest movie White Noise dropped on Netflix over the holidays, and well, how to describe it? Is it a disaster movie? Is it a family drama? A drugged-out conspiracy thriller? Or perhaps even a black comedy? Ask the man himself, and he'll tell you that it's kind of all of the above, and on a personal note for him, something else altogether. Yes, White Noise is a dystopian delight that represents the biggest left turn of this acclaimed writer-director's career so far. Since bursting into the spotlight 2 decades ago, The New Yorker has become renowned for creating these intensely intimate snapshots of American family life. From The Squid and the Whale to 2019's incredible Marriage Story, his movies are typically small in scale but big in emotional depth, delving deep into the interpersonal lives of characters who you can't help but fall in love with. At least, that's what used to define a Baumbach movie. White Noise is the sound of this author stepping boldly out of his comfort zone. It's an apocalyptic adaptation of a novel that till now was thought to be unfilmable. The revered author Don DeLillo's postmodern tome was full of dense prose, lyrical absurdity, and satirical sharpshooting at American hysteria. A lot of the story takes place in a supermarket that's both a community hub and a cathedral to American consumerism. And a large chunk of the movie involves grand CGI depictions of a toxic cloud engulfing a community who descend into panic and lawlessness, all things pretty far removed from the grounded domesticity of Noah's typical storytelling. In the conversation you're about to hear, Noah tells me why now was the right time for such a departure. We talk about how he called on the disorientation of traumatic events in his own life, like 9/11, divorce, and his father's death, to shape its foreboding mood. We talk about his love for hiding in the opening scene of his films an encapsulation of the thematic content to come, and why he chose to make one major change to the novel, involving the character Babette, played by Greta Gerwig, who happens to be his partner. A couple of things to mention. This one was recorded over the phone with Noah dialing in from an undisclosed location, so apologies if the audio takes a minute or two for your ears to adjust to. I do promise it's worth persevering with. It's also worth mentioning, of course, that this is a spoiler-filled conversation, so if you haven't seen White Noise yet, come on, you know what to do. Hit pause now, go watch the movie, it's on Netflix, then come back as we dive into every detail of this great film. A big thank you as ever to our Patreon community for helping make this episode possible. Head to patreon.com/scriptapart if you'd like to get involved there. Okay, with no further ado, this is Noah Baumbach discussing the first draft secrets of White Noise. Thanks for tuning in. Happy New Year once again, guys. 2023, let's make it a good one. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Hey Noah, welcome to Script Apart. It's a delight to have you with us. I'll be real with you. Ever since I saw White Noise, every time I go to the supermarket, the temptation to break into a little dance, it's pretty intense.
So there's no shame in that. You should just do it then.
In all seriousness though, Noah, White Noise really has kind of embedded itself in my brain since I caught it over the weekend. I'm really fascinated by it, not just on its own terms, as this brilliantly daring kind of fever dream style movie, but also just as a Noah Baumbach movie. I'm captivated by the ways in which it's both a departure from and an extension of your typical storytelling. So I wanted to start off by asking about the significance of the particular moment in your career that White Noise arrives in. So your last film was of course Marriage Story, which I loved. It felt so personal and emotionally bruising to watch, so I can only assume it might have been emotionally bruising to write as well. From interviews I've read, you pulled quite heavily from your own life, as all your movies are wont to do, but perhaps more so than ever with that project. Is it a coincidence that, you found yourself here reaching for someone else's material and adapting someone else's story for the first time after Marriage Story? Consciously or subconsciously, did you need something different and a story that wasn't your own to follow up that project?
That's an interesting question, and I've become more aware of these things in retrospect. I mean, I look back even at other movies in my life and career where I realized, oh, I actually was shaking things up in a way I didn't even realize I was shaking things up. Like Frances Ha was one of those where I had there were conscious things I wanted to do very differently with that movie. In terms of production style, I wanted to make something with very few people and in some cases sort of under the radar. I felt like it would create a freedom that I was feeling, that I was craving in a way from traditional filmmaking, to make movies in a traditional way. But there were also many other things when I look back at the movie, and even the movie itself, creatively, that I was also doing that I didn't realize I was doing. So all this is to say, my consciously, when I had finished Marriage Story, it was the first time in my career that I didn't know what I wanted to make next. And I just naturally found myself, when I'm finishing a movie, at some point in the sort of maybe second half of making a movie, I start things that I've been musing about, or notes I've taken, or themes, characters, whatever it is, that generally start to rise to the surface. And I start to feel like, oh, now I can see the movie. Again, it could be ideas, characters, locations. It just, there are things that I carry around with me that I think, oh, one day I might want to do something like this, but I don't yet see it. And usually those start to clarify for me. But with Marriage Story, I really felt empty for the first time. It was both scary, and also there was a freeing feeling too that was exciting. But the coincidence, as you alluded to, did come that I happened to be rereading White Noise at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And I was struck over and over again as I read it. And I would read passages aloud to Greta and say, who had also read it, many years earlier, how much this not only speaks to the moment in terms of themes and subject matter, story, but the tone of it, the tone that you also spoke about, is the fever dream quality of it. Just felt like the world was feeling to me. It was capturing a feeling that I had. We all have those days where the world doesn't feel quite real, and often they can come after traumatic experience. I felt it when my father died. This sort of alternate reality of both familiar and unfamiliar, and I was feeling that in a kind of more maybe low boil way, simmer way. And then when the pandemic happened and we were in New York City again, and suddenly, after we'd been traveling around the world quite a bit, for Marriage Story and Greta for Little Women, we were suddenly, locked down in our apartment. And it really spoke to that feeling. And I did have that sort of traumatic, that feeling of trauma. And, we were lucky that we weren't sick or, having, genuine tragedies that came from the pandemic, but just that feeling of the world feeling strange and unfamiliar, and everything around me, my apartment, my things, everything is familiar, but nothing feels like it usually does. And that's what the book really spoke to in me. It felt very personal. And I felt like, well, here's a way for me to express something that feels very personal, but do it through this other voice, this novel.
That's so interesting. What an incredible time to be revisiting this novel. I mean, the title of the novel alone, White Noise, it's about disorientation, and there was perhaps no more disorientating time in sort of history, in Western society certainly, than these last few years. I suppose we probably should just sort of address the sort of COVID of it all up front. There's a moment in the film where the name of the threat is seemingly updating itself from minute by minute. It evolves from being a feathery plume to a billowing cloud to finally the airborne toxic event. The advice from authorities seems to kind of constantly be pinballing during the disaster movie segment of the film, much like it was during COVID's onset. And, the disorientating nature of COVID-era society carries through in the film. Late on in the film, there's a really funny little aside, like a grace note, where there's an announcement over the tannoy in the supermarket in which shoppers are told to disregard a previous announcement and then to regard it again following new information. How did you go about inserting some of that panic and that disorientation, like I suppose not just of the pandemic, but of the Trump years and social media era society, into this book that was, that was written it's released in 1985. Presumably it was written in the years kind of preceding that.
Right. No, and I would add to that, the symptoms keep getting updated as well, which also was something we were experiencing, and seemed to get more surreal and impossible. I mean, the fact that one might truly lose their smell and taste, seemed of science fiction, at that time. And of course, in the book and the movie, it's deja vu, and what's remarkable about the novel is that all of that was in there, and I was excavating it and putting it in this new setting, in this new form, and finding cinematic analogs for what he was doing in a very literary way. And the supermarket announcement is a good example of that. The supermarket. He, in the novel, he'll end a paragraph with just maybe a snippet from the television or the radio or the supermarket. Panasonic being a kind of famous one, which comes later in the book. It's just its own sentence. Those things were sort of, I felt, very available to me from the novel, but then also my task was to find the movie equivalents. And, of course, they change. I mean, things that you read become very different once you have, human beings and expressive, emotional actors, with faces and noses and ears and mouths saying these things, and so it does transform it. It grounds it in a different way. I wanted to maintain, and find an equivalent sort of elevated reality that the book created so well, but find the movie version, knowing that by the fact of that you're going to see these things and these things become real and more tactile, that it grounds it in a way that's different. When you're reading the kids in the book, who are, hilarious, but they become representations of kids. They're both very recognizable as real kids, but also they're literary kids. And once you cast these wonderful kids that I did cast, who were very sensitive and human, it creates something else. And that was something I was always trying to remain aware of. The things like hearing things in the supermarket, I used some things from the book, but then we also created a kind of character for the supermarket megaphone. And David Newman, actually, who choreographed the dance sequence that you might one day imitate in Tesco. He worked throughout the movie with me on all the scenes, even the scenes that have sort of maybe a much more nuanced choreography. But he also was the voice of the supermarket, so he was he's all over the place.
And as different as the film is to your past work, as much as it must have been clear as you kind of contemplated adapting it, that this was going to require you kind of pushing into exciting new territory, I suppose, as a director, were you kind of conscious of the ways that you were potentially able to take Don's story and meld it with some of your pre-existing preoccupations as a storyteller? Like it's another family-driven story, for example, which has been a major part of your signature as a filmmaker, Noah. Was the family dynamic at the heart of the movie like a North Star for you as you wrote it? Like as I watched it, I think I very much imagined that your way into the story, your way of making this near impossible undertaking seem less daunting, might have been kind of, sort of considering it as a family story like you've always written, and kind of expanding the world from there.
Well, it's another one of those things that I could look at retrospectively. I think I just trusted the fact that I responded so strongly to it that it was speaking to me, and it was something that I was compelled to adapt. So thus it had to be personal. It had to have some connection to what I've done in the past. And if it doesn't, didn't really matter to me. This is something that felt compelling to me. And it was a kind of, live wire that I felt I needed to follow. But retrospectively, of course, I mean, it is ultimately a movie about family, and a movie, I would say I've always been interested in, as you say, family. And I think specifically, family dynamics, but family mythologies too, and the stories we tell ourselves, and how there's both the group dynamic, there's the parent-child dynamic, there's the stories our parents tell us about ourselves, and then the unlearning of that comes with maturity and adulthood in a lot of cases. Squid and the Whale is about that from an adolescent perspective, and Meyerowitz is about that from a grown-up perspective. What DeLillo had created, which I found very interesting, was the family as, in some ways, as a kind of microcosm for a representation of the culture at large. This notion of family is the cradle of the world's misinformation that Murray says, which I think is, a wonderful line. And it's so this notion of, you have the kids going a mile a minute, like a radio that's just been left on, and they're full of facts and thoughts, and it is, of course, it's like a kind of white noise in the movie, but it's also a form of, there is communication in there. There is warmth. There is connection, even in the disconnection. And, and then when you bring the choreography into it and the sort of motion, you look at taking, like, say, the very early scene in the movie where they're making breakfast and they're all talking. And it's both an introduction to the family, but it's also an introduction to this tone, this movement, this way of talking, dialogue as kind of music in a way. It's also telling the story of Babette and the pill and what's going on underneath this subterranean story, which is, of course, what's being hidden in all of this movement and talk. And I was very drawn to that, of how these rituals and strategies and routines that we are both complicit in and victim to. I mean, there are things that have been sort of established for us in the world that we find ourselves participating in. And then there's the things we do at home that give life meaning, or seem to give life meaning, that are both beautiful and joyful. The dance in the supermarket, in a sense, embodies that. But they also become distraction or can become distraction and a barrier between us and maybe a kind of more honest, complete, fuller life. And you see that in the marriage between Jack and Babette. So I think certainly all of those things, those sorts of themes are not inconsistent with the work I've done in the past and the things that I've written, that my original material. But I was interested how it worked in a bigger sense here too, how it became a representation, as I said, of the culture, and how we're doing that in much bigger ways. The way, and DeLillo, of course, it's all in there. It's with the radio and the television, because we're hearing these things from the outside. We're seeing where these things are coming from too, why we're echoing thoughts and facts, and how we're, both the comfort in having some outside source give us meaning to something that seems to have no meaning, whether it's true or not. It's just comforting to have somebody tell us what it is.
And that culture that you mentioned, the sort of, I suppose, slightly warped, media-saturated vision of American society that we see in White Noise, in which, families crowd around the TV to watch plane crashes and things like that. How do you describe that? And what do you see as being the relationship between the America of today and, the sort of cranked version of it that we see in the film? Is there a sort of element of a cautionary tale that that's embedded in White Noise and Don's novel, that that's where we're headed if certain impulses in society aren't kind of curbed? How do you kind of sum up the world that this family inhabit?
I mean, I think we're there already. It would be cautionary. Maybe when the book came out, maybe it was cautionary. I think it's in our rear view now. I mean, the internet it maybe makes it less pointed as standing around the TV watching a plane crash. I mean, it's a more satirical version of it. But, of course, DeLillo's writing in a world where you can change channels and you can watch a plane crash on the news, and then you can turn to a sitcom on Channel 4. we live in a world where we can watch them simultaneously, and do. I mean, this Bo Burnham song, it's everything. What does he say? Everything.
A little bit of everything all of the time.
Yeah, all of the time. Yeah, exactly. It's a more innocent version of it, and when you only have, because technology hadn't gotten to the place where it is now, which DeLillo also talks about. I mean, this sort of, Babette says when she's at the Boy Scout camp, says she's talking about the latest innovation that's fighting the toxic cloud and how scared it makes her. And she says, the greater the scientific advance, the more scared I get. I think there is something that, Don was really on to also about technology and as it advances, what it does to us and the fear that it creates. I think we're past the cautionary tale part of it.
I'm intrigued by how your process did or didn't change, kind of moving into adapting someone else's material for the first time. Just so I can get a baseline for how you normally write before we maybe talk about how different it was adapting. Am I right in thinking that you often start your films with snippets of dialogue, that's your seed, and you build out characters, worlds, and plots from there? How does your process typically work when you're not, in the process of adaptation?
It's different for every movie and every script. Dialogue is certainly a way in often for me, or one of the ways in. I hear people talking and I follow that, and I follow a kind of chain of conversation. And that's something I've always done. I think from Kicking and Screaming onward, it's the way of writing myself into not only character, but story and some kind of understanding of what it is I'm getting at. It's like writing is interesting that way. You come into something with a kind of, often you have a feeling about a scene or a character, or there's a line you've overheard that for whatever reason strikes you as funny, or a line I find myself writing that for whatever reason it's phrased a way that is different than I would have normally phrased it. And that then the reply to that is influenced by whatever that phrase is. So it's, I suppose, a kind of improvisation with myself that helps me into whatever it is. Now, that usually coincides with having something, something else that I want to address. I mean, take Marriage Story, for example. I wanted to write about the process of divorce, that on one level, and this is again going to talking about, sort of when the world feels unreal to you, those times, divorce is another one. I think everyone who's been divorced recognizes this. It's a trauma, and your emotional life is in some sort of turmoil, and your kind of perceptions, your balance, everything is off. And because by design, you're disrupting familiarity. You're something you've grown very accustomed to and very familiar with. If you have children, it's complicated, 1,000-fold. It's all thrown up in the air and with uncertainty, and so all the things we know to expect. We go to work, we come home, there's our family. All of that suddenly is up for grabs, and it's going to change. And you have that going simultaneously with this legal process, something that is, run by professionals who have studied this law and have ways they work within this system that is both sensical and nonsensical at the same time. So you're thrown into a kind of Kafkaesque world, while at the same time you're dealing with an emotional Kafkaesque world, and I thought, well, that to me, I felt like I hadn't quite seen in a movie, and was interesting to me, and it was something personal to me, something I'd gone through, and I wanted to tell that story. Now, that also then coincided with writing these characters and writing these dialogues and starting to understand the people, and then I'm also writing about different locations. I'm thinking, well, okay, this part is in New York and this part is in Los Angeles. And then that becomes a different way in. And now I'm writing environment and thinking about, well, what does the environment do to you? And okay, what are their jobs and what is that? And I'm learning all of these things as I'm writing, and then going back and revising as I start to understand more. So it's, and I tend to write in a way where I like to revise as I go. I edit this way too, because I don't like to get too far ahead of myself and it's like write a 120 page script and then go back and rewrite from page one. I have many things that I know I want to get to, and I might have some scene lists and things that I know, okay, ultimately we're going to get to this scene in the courtroom, or we're going to get to this, this moment here, where she's going to tie his shoe, or, things that were ideas I had. Now, it doesn't mean that those things all stay, because once I keep revising and understanding it more and working, sometimes I arrive at those moments and they don't work anymore. They're not telling the story anymore. They're telling an older story that helped get me to the place to help me understand earlier pieces, and now are no longer relevant. And so those things get cut, but sometimes they stay. Sometimes I understand why I had them in there to begin with. Oh, this is what this is about. This is why I wrote this. The opening of Marriage Story, which is they're writing these sort of tributes to one another, and we experience them visually, and then we find out that this is something that's an exercise with a mediator in their divorce. And I wrote those in part to understand the characters, because it was a way to look at the characters through the other's eyes. And so, but of course, once it was in there and once it then took on this function in the movie, it helped me go forward. And it also helped me much later in the movie, because then I was, well, what if we return to these letters? What if that came back? Things like that, which again are not, they become good story moments or good movie moments, but you only get to them by doing the earlier part or doing another part. So all this is to say is there's no one way to do it, and every script provides a different challenge. I'm writing something now, which it's the first time in a while where I really don't know where I'm going with it. And that's scary and thrilling at the same time. So I can go down, I can write 50 pages and then take them out and go back, and go back to, an earlier part and start again, because I can feel like, I took the wrong lane. This is another long way of saying, I suppose I have ways that I do this, but I also remain open to the fact that I'm an amateur each time I'm doing it. You're a beginner with this movie all the time, every time. It's like the last movie doesn't give you can't use the stuff from the last movie. And when you finish them, they often feel like I look back and think, like, how did I do that? That's, a friend of mine that wrote me, they'd just shown the Squid and the Whale to their teenage child, and they quoted something of the movie back to me, and they were seeing it in a way as a part of the whole and as a kind of something that really worked for them in terms of like the way it was phrased and the way the scene played out. And I was impressed that I had figured that out, looking back at that. I thought, well, I'm glad I arrived at that, because it's like, they're all smarter and wiser than you are, the scripts, the work, the movies, they have to be. I always feel a little bit like a fraud in trying to even talk about how I got there or what I did, because maybe fraud's not the right way, or a piker or something. It's like the movie's better than me. I mean, in a way, it's like, it's wiser, it's more sensitive, it's more emotionally mature. And that's because the process allows for that. It's like, it's like you're aware of what it can do better than you. And so you try to follow that. I was reading George Saunders has this wonderful book about,
do you know this book? Swim in the Rain in the Pond.
Yeah.
Swim in the Pond in the Rain.
Yeah. Pond in the Rain. Yeah. I think it's Milan Kundera. He has a quote about this very thing, that about writers writers not maybe saying writers shouldn't be representatives, for the culture, but they should. He's like, I'd go further and say they're not representatives for themselves. That they are. The work is wiser than they are, and he talks about. I guess Tolstoy, when he was writing Anna Karenina, was much more critical of Anna, and essentially her death was a kind of punishment, for her immorality. But as he wrote it, of course, the novel is very different from that. The novel is very sympathetic and understanding of her. But he said, he says, I wouldn't say that Tolstoy, he's like, I don't think Tolstoy got wiser or more generous as a person as he wrote it. But what he did is he followed the train of the novel and wrote the best novel. And I think that's really so smart about writing. It's and movie making, to go further, is that if you're good at it, it's going to always be better expression than what you can do as yourself.
Yeah, I guess a great encapsulation of that, which also leads us quite neatly into sort of some of the key scenes from the film. In Greenberg, you opened that film with a scene in which Greta's character's in a car. She's attempting to merge in traffic, and she asks, "Are you going to let me in?" And you described in a lecture once how Greta once told you that the openings of your movies tend to encapsulate the narrative journey that audiences are about to go on. And this was news to you. The Squid and the Whale obviously begins with the line, "Mom and me versus me and Dad," and that's that movie in a nutshell. In the case of Greenberg, that line, "Are you going to let me in?" That was a movie ultimately, thematically, about letting people in, and it kind of came to you as a shock that
right.
There was that, there was that synergy there, and that perhaps your synapses were firing in a way you hadn't been conscious of. Do you feel like the beginning of White Noise, in which Don Cheadle's character Murray gives this speech about the history and primal splendor of car crashes in American cinema, does that make a similar declaration about the movie that audiences are about to see?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, and it was something I was more conscious of, which was much of what he says is taken from the book, but it's not presented as an actual lecture, and it doesn't have the visual accompaniment. And I felt it was very much, this notion that car crashes are in movies are this sort of representation of the sort of American ingenuity in entertainment, that our appreciation of it is removed from the actual event itself. So like he says, like Thanksgiving and the 4th of July, which are, of course, come from all this brutality, but we don't celebrate that. We're celebrating the fact that we, love fireworks and love turkey, and we're celebrating this country. And, it's obviously an incredibly ironic, brilliantly satirical thing of Don's. But I felt the sort of excitement in a movie of doing that, where you could actually watch these car crashes and watch crashes that have already been filmed and done throughout the years. And of course, you put it in a lecture and in a college, and then it's like they're also setting up the college and you're setting up that world. But I felt like it was a very good way to kind of set the tone for the movie, and also set the tone for the audience of what they're going to watch. On one hand, putting it in a specific world, a college where this is the sort of thing that's taught. And then in another way, suggesting a way that one might want to watch this movie, so that when you see a car crash later in the movie, or you see a train crash, or you see that you're watching it, both as part of the actual narrative, but you're also seeing it in light of this lecture and this, and in this other light. So I think, the other thing I would say about it too is that, when you then see the family, a few minutes later, you're introduced to the family in the kitchen, and they're moving around, and they're near misses with each other as they sort of essentially dance around one another, making their breakfast and having their conversations. Is it also, I felt, suggests this idea of it's completed at the end with the dance, but how we sort of go through life too, as in these sort of avoiding collision, and then occasionally we do collide, and is there catharsis sometimes in a collision? And it also, of course, is this notion of death, which hangs over the whole movie, which is we develop our lives so that death remains abstract, or we don't want to think about it. We put it out of our minds. We think, oh, well, we often believe on some level, well, but not me. I'm going to somehow find a way to get around this thing. And, but then strangely, or maybe not so strangely, we are compelled to, we put it in our entertainment. We watch, how many disaster movies, superhero movies that destroy cities, and, we've seen New York get destroyed so many times in movies, and it creates some sort of pleasure at the same time. So, what is that? Why are we both drawn to it in our entertainment in ways that we're afraid to acknowledge it in our lives? And that's also implicit in Murray's lecture.
As you say, the sort of talk at the beginning about crashes, that very much sets up the crash that's going to be an inciting incident, of course, of sorts in this film. There's a train wreck that sets in motion the toxic airborne event that we see. You intercut between that imminent disaster as it unfolds and a kind of academic rap battle, I suppose, for lack of a better phrase, between Jack and Murray. So Jack is a professor of Hitler studies, the study of Adolf Hitler. And Murray, his kind of colleague in academia, his specialty subject is Elvis. And yeah, you juxtapose these seemingly two unconnected subjects, Hitler and Elvis, with this scene of sort of, twisted metal and kind of, catastrophe. What were those things kind of coming together in that scene to express, Noah? And what was the significance to you of the role of kind of Hitler in this film in regards to Jack's job?
Yeah, well, and that's also that in the book you don't see the crash. The crash happens, whatever the equivalent of off camera is in a book, off page. It's not. It was actually when this is a kind of good example of how screenwriting works, I suppose, is the crashes. By putting that lecture at the beginning of the movie, I felt like I needed to then show a crash to continue that thread, to sort of answer it in some way. So that gave me the idea to include the crash and show the crash, because I felt, well, also that's such a movie thing, crashes, and we've already established that. That led me then to think, well, when does it happen? Well, it should happen then in conjunction with the Hitler Elvis lecture. And with Jack, then I had Jack kind of, which is in the novel, is Jack takes over the lecture in some way. He kind of, and evangelizes in some way about Hitler. And if you can use those two terms together, maybe I shouldn't, but it became a kind of summoning in a way. It was like Adam and I talked a lot about that. It was in a sense almost like the sequences you've seen in movies where, it's like, I don't know who the witch or wizard is chanting, and then something, the monster's being created at the same time somewhere else. And I can't think of an actual movie that does that, but I feel like I've seen it several times. We work with David Newman, the choreographer, on that whole sequence as well. That's a very choreographed sequence. And so that as Jack kind of takes over, he is summoning death. He's bringing death forward, and something that's been, that he's been carrying around in his unconscious, and he's sort of at kind of a low simmer, is now coming to a boil. And he, I link it to the dream. The dream is, it's sort of him seeing death in his room, and death climbing into bed with him, which of course is also where his wife should be. And so that he's when we dream, of course, our unconscious is trying to bring things to the surface that we often don't want to, acknowledge consciously, or we have difficulty acknowledging them consciously. And so here, in a sense, I felt like he is both willingly and unwittingly summoning death and bringing it forward, because he knows on some level it has to. That, of course, then gives you this sort of movie moments, which were the cross cutting and we choreographed Adam's movements to work with the movements of the train and the truck as well, so that things would work as a kind of call and response or a dance and be of a piece.
And we should talk as well about Babette's arc in this movie, like the sort of portion of the film in which our characters are existing under a literal cloud of fear. Good year for that, by the way, with Jordan Peele's Nope as well. That section of the film kind of gives way to this sort of drug deal conspiracy plot, which is much more domesticated and set inside the family's home. White Noise, both in your telling of it and obviously in Don's, it seems a story in which there's a refusal to confront our mortality that results in an escape through TV, through material consumption, through chemical cures. Is that kind of what Babette's arc is intended to express? Like, what was your, having lived with this novel since your teens and now having kind of grappled with it in bringing it to the screen, what's your read of that second portion of the film?
Well, and it should be, I suppose, pointed out too, is the movie, her role in the second half of the movie is changed from the novel. In the novel, she doesn't go to the motel. She's not part of the attempted killing of Mr. Gray and the German nuns and that whole section. So, and I that was something, and this is perhaps a further answer to your question about where this movie connects with my other work, is I was interested in seeing this and thinking about Babette's character. I became interested in seeing the movie as a kind of comedy of remarriage. That beginning of the movie, Babette in some sense exists as a kind of projection of Jack's. I mean, she seems okay, but we of course see that there's something going on with her. I mean, we know she's taking the pill. There are comments here or there. We see her driving away. And of course, Denise is on to her and has this idea. And we see how Jack kind of brushes it aside. And so she lives for the first half of the movie in some way as more of a mystery. And in the novel, of course, you're in his head more. So she's always a kind of projection of his. And this went to, as I was writing it, and thinking of Greta playing it, was the necessary shift that has to happen when now that she is she's Greta, she's somebody we watch and respond to. It's not someone we have in our heads and are thinking about through Jack's description of her from, like, in the novel. This is now somebody. This is a real character in the movie. So. And of course, also thinking, well, Greta, I love working with Greta, and she's such a wonderful actress, and sort of thinking of things that she could do. And so this notion of this sort of sequence that comes in the third part of the movie is where Babette tells Jack what has been going on, which is this epic confession scene, which is in the book, but in the movie, I think it does something different in that, because we're watching now this wonderful actor tell this story and the emotion that accompanies it. And, on one hand, it's a totally bonkers thing she's saying, I mean, it's stuff of science fiction but they're playing it very human. I mean, it's quite an emotional sequence. And I really liked that idea of doing something that would be both strange and other, and also very human. And it's something we see, I feel like David Lynch does so wonderfully sometimes too. It's like where, I remember in Twin Peaks when Laura Palmer's parents find out that she's been killed. It's like the emotion is so strong. It's really treated seriously, even though everything else is so other and dreamlike. So anyway, I mean, Greta always described in that sequence, she said it's almost like that bet drops into her own body, like that she's been living kind of outside herself for much of the movie. And here she, in some ways, becomes more herself. And I think that's another theme of the movie, and part of the story of the movie is this becoming more ourselves. And how do you become more yourselves? And what are the sort of ugly, unhappy things you need to open yourself up to maybe make yourself to help balance and complete yourself in some way. I mean, not that we ever complete ourselves, and that's something also I've always been interested in my movies, is these notions we have of ourselves and the people around us, and then the realities of that, and the difficult work it takes to get there. I mean, it's why real therapy is such a long-term commitment, because it's not, these things don't happen. I mean, in a movie, they can happen in a big emotional scene, but in life, it's like a slow dripping faucet, And but that's, I think I see Jack and Babette at the end of the movie. It's like now they can begin to try now the marriage can begin in some way. It's like they've been living together but apart. And the thing that kept them apart was actually, it was something that they shared. It was death, and this sort of fear of death. It both separated them, and then it also, in the end, it links them. And I find that very moving and emotional and romantic idea that these sort of ugly secrets we keep from each other, or can keep from each other, are actually the things that might actually bring us together. I mean, and I do that visually in the movie with the Mr. Gray character in the shopping cart, as they're on the gurneys, and he's between them as they're being rolled down the emergency room, and then he's moved away and they're pushed together.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a kind of lovely idea that here's this, this character who represents death, who they've tried to kill, which is an absurd notion, or he's tried to kill, and you can't kill him. He's still alive. He's still out there, but you have to go on living.
Yeah, it's a perfect note to end the film on, and well, I guess it's a good note to end this episode on as well, Noah. I'll close out by asking though, now that you've conquered your first adaptation, like looking to the future, are there other authors who you'd love to adapt? I know you mentioned George Saunders as someone you have a lot of respect for. He's a friend of the show. Can you see yourself taking on one of his stories, or are there any other authors? I'm curious sort of how you see the next chapter of your career from here unfolding, because of course your next project that we'll be seeing on screen is Barbie, which you co-wrote with Greta. I'm curious to know that those are two projects in a row now that represent kind of markedly different types of movies than we're used to getting from you. What do you think about the sort of the years ahead and sort of what you might take on next? Are we going to continue to see more of these departures, and will adaptation be something we see again?
I'm just full of surprises. I can only be in the time I'm in, really. I don't know. I've always made movies that, like, as I said before, that are connected to the sort of livest wire in my brain, the thing that seems like it has the most excitement, electricity, the kind of clearest, a way of expressing something or many things that I've been preoccupied with or feel, or, events in my life that I've wanted to try to make sense of, the resulting script and movie are just the best way I know how to do it at that time. And in that way, as you were saying earlier, I don't, White Noise, it's different in certain ways because it's an adaptation, but it's a very personal movie for me because it's very connected. Like I said, it's sort of, it was my kind of answer to the time, the last few years. So I don't know. I will continue doing it the way I've been doing it, which is the only, is making things that are meaningful to me. And Barbie was kind of wonderful. It was also during the pandemic, or the sort of, I suppose, the early, what we sort of think of as the main part of the pandemic. But I wrote White Noise, and then we wrote Barbie, and they funny way they kind of relate to each other, and certainly in ways that we see, but I don't, we'll see if other people recognize them. But that feels very personal to me too. And the collaboration with Greta, which is something I feel lucky to have and be able to, White Noise is a collaboration as well, because she's in it. And also, her is something I spoke to her about. She read many of the drafts and, they sort of been, so I don't know is the answer. I mean, I'm writing an original movie now, and I'll always do that. Adaptations. I mean, it's when I read anything, I think at some point when I'm reading it, I will think of a movie, like what is a movie version of this scene, or if some scenes might feel very much like movies scenes, other scenes don't, and you think, oh, that could be an interesting thing to do, but I don't go past that. It's just the way my mind works. It's a kind of musing. But with White Noise, I took it all the way. So we'll see. George wrote I thought a really wonderful script of Civil War Land that Ben Stiller was going to make. And I read that years ago, and I still would love to see that movie get made. I think he really captured a kind of, movie equivalent of what he does so brilliantly, in literature.
Absolutely. Well, fingers crossed for a collaboration there, Noah. I'll let you go, man. It's been such a fun hour chatting with you. Congratulations again on this film. It's going to be rattling around in my brain for a long time. And I, in turn, am going to be dancing in Tesco's for a while, I suspect.
Yeah, if you started, I'm sure people will follow.
The legacy, the impact of this film. All right. Well, thank you again so much, Noah. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun.
You've been listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.